I was talking to my aunt yesterday, who's very on top of current events and some of the Israeli conflict stuff that's been happening recently. And she told me an interesting parallel that I have since learned a little bit about and wanted to share because I'm sure some are familiar, but her perspective and some of her firsthand experience is really interesting. She has been in Israel when there has been bombings and has experienced the shelter experience, where you're in the bomb shelters in Israel, and she's made friends over there. And so recently, with the past few days of different attacks that are going on, she was relating that the Israeli people, specifically the Jewish people, are in their bomb shelters during this time, which for them is very normal. Maybe, where I live, we get seasonal flooding. And so it's probably something like that where when we in the States think of going into a bomb shelter, it would be very traumatic. And for them, it's something that they experience quite often. So even though it may not be normal, it's not atypical. So they're in the bomb shelters, and it just so happens that they're in the shelters during Purim, or maybe it's pronounced Purim. And this is a Jewish holiday where they read and celebrate the story of Esther. And the story of Esther is a really cool story, but at the time that they're reading it, they don't realize, but there is an attack happening in Iran that apparently has destroyed the leadership of Iran. And so now there's big questions about who's going to take over there. And so as they're reading this, and then as they're coming out of their celebrations in their bunkers, they're realizing that there's these parallels, and the parallels are quite fascinating. I've seen plenty of these parallels before, and so in the end, these parallels are not typically seen as coincidental by the Jewish people. To them, this is something, that happens all the time, where God manifests his hand in protecting the Jewish people in some form or another, because they're God's chosen people, and they've made this covenant with them. So in this story of Esther, just the 2-minute recap for those that don't remember, the king marries a beautiful woman that he is unaware is Jewish. She doesn't tell him that she's Jewish, but there is a man in his kingdom, in the king's kingdom, who secretly plots to kill the Jewish people. And in his plot, he's deceiving the king and kind of tricking the king into going along with his plan. And eventually the queen, who is, recent queen, who is Jewish but hasn't told the king yet, finds out about the scheme, and decides that she's going to tell the king. And she comes up with a plan, tells the king, and the man who had the plot, his name is Haman. So Haman's there, and she says, "Hey, king, Haman's planning on killing all the Jews." And the king's like, "Okay, why? What's with that?" And Haman's like, "What?" Tries to explain himself, but then the queen says, "This is a problem for me because I'm Jewish." And the king is like, "Oh my gosh, this can't happen. And so we need to figure out what's going on here." And in the process finds out that Haman has deceived him and come up with this plan, and king doesn't like it. And so he kills Haman. But the way that he kills Haman is that he hangs him with the gallows, using the gallows that Haman himself had built for the Jewish people, starting with Mordecai. And so the Jews see this as a celebration of how God will let the evils of the world combine against the Jewish people, and then those same evils that are combined will, in the end, be used against the enemies of God's chosen people. So it's this great story of faith and trust and leaving God to do his work. Well, as they're reading this story, bombs are dropping in Iran, and Khomeini is killed, and a lot of the Iranian leadership is killed. And that leadership has a history of being very antagonistic or even violent against the Jewish people and against Israel. And they've been known to say things like salvation will not come until the last drop of Jewish blood hits the ground, really scary things like that. And so they come out of their shelters seeing all this, and in their minds, there's a direct correlation between Khomeini, who has built a war force against Israel, and how that war force is now retaliating against him, and he has now been killed by the war that he created, by the war that he started in a lot of ways. And, I'm not super political, and so I know that there's a lot of positions to take on this and a lot of interest in spinning in different ways. It's interesting to see not just the perspective of the Israeli people in this situation, but the lived experience of being in the bunkers. Like, it's kind of insane that you would be hunkered down reading this story and then come out to find out that during the celebration of when God's enemies are killed by their own forces, you find out that your enemies are killed by their own forces on the same day. On the same day that you're reading the story and celebrating Purim, it's happening in the country next to you. And then there are some connections that some of the Jewish people have made to the ancestors of Haman, because we don't have their genealogical records, but the tradition is that Haman comes from the people of Amalek, who are kind of like the original antagonists towards the Jewish people. And so when they were coming out of Egypt, the people of Amalek, or the Amalekites, or whatever they call them, they were the ones who first tried to destroy the Jews as commanded by the Egyptians. And then God said, I'll protect you, and I'm going to destroy the people of Amalek. And then when Haman comes along, they call him after the names of Amalek. Like they call him, whether he's a direct descendant or not, maybe that's a mystery, but the tradition is that he is after the tradition of Amalek, that he's trying to kill the Jews just because that is their tradition, and that the Jewish people can trust that God will protect his people. And it's just a fun story. Like, we have those same traditions and stories in our own history, the LDS history of persecution, even with pioneer. I mean, I've been thinking about this recently with the current cultural shift, how being theist is now seen as kind of punk rock, and how things really do have this pendulum swing to them. I mean, you can call it a pendulum swing, where if you wait long enough, things just kind of come back around on themselves. But the truth is that I think whether it's God intervening and directly contributing his efforts on his behalf of on the behalf of his people or not, it doesn't really matter that much to me, as much as it matters to see that we as a human species, whether it's God or just our nature or whatever it is, we tend towards goodness. We tend towards a good outcome, the well-being of all of us, which a lot of people don't believe. A lot of people think that we are, as a group, nihilistic and we all want to destroy each other. But we have survived a very long time, even though we at different times have been very capable of nihilism. All right, that's it. See you guys.